Welcome back, everyone, and welcome, Brian. Thank you for joining us. This is a very exciting discussion we're going to have around SAMM benchmarking, a pretty exciting project that Brian Glas has been leading, which is intended to answer the basic question of how do I compare? And he's going to take us through some current plans and status, discuss some user stories and ideas around the design. Brian has been involved with SAMM for a number of years and in the IT field in general. He's been co-lead for the OWASP SAMM project since version 1.1 and is also part of the OWASP Top 10 since 2017. So thank you, Brian. Welcome to the talk, and take it away.
Thanks, John. Hang on, let me, my Mac has nice security controls. Try and keep me from sharing the screen when I'm not supposed to. There we go. All right, can you all see that?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, so I get SAMM benchmark. So now that y'all are properly worn out from staring at a screen for hours, now I get to talk. So a little bit about me. I've got 4 kids, and my oldest is actually going to college this year. So I'm feeling kind of old at the moment. She starts in about 8 weeks. But I'm currently a assistant professor of computer science, who I managed to talk my administration into letting me run a cybersecurity major now. So I'm really looking forward to that. But I've spent upwards of 20 years doing both development and then information security, mostly application security, both as client and consultant. So I've been working on SAMM for a good while now. Also contribute to the top 10. So 2017, 2020, and all that. So for SAMM, the number one question that we get in SAMM that we've been trying really hard to figure out how to answer is, how do we help people answer the question, how do I compare? And it's actually a little bit harder than it would initially seem. So one of the pros for SAMM is that it's basically vendor agnostic. Being part of an OWASP project, there's some basically third-party neutrality, credibility within SAMM, but you also have basically a meeting of the minds. You have a bunch of people who have a bunch of experience and that's widely varied that are all helping contribute to the model. Unfortunately, that level of decentralization makes it very difficult to actually have a centralized data store of all this information. And it's not just having the data store, it's having like standards or consistency about how data is collected, how data is cultivated, stuff like that. So one of the things that we're wanting to do within Benchmark is help try and solve some of that. One of the bigger hindrances I've seen for actually adopting SAMM is that people really, really want to know how they compare. And a lot of that's human nature, and a lot of that's just the nature of business at this point. If you go into an organization as a consultant and they'll be like, all right, we have a score of 1.86 overall. Is that good or bad? Or how about my competitors? Is that, am I ahead of the game? Do I have a lot of catch up to do? Answers to those questions a lot of times will drive the priority of how something works within an organization and their culture. So one of the goals of Benchmark is basically to collect the most comprehensive data set related to organizational maturity of an AppSec or a software security program. So, and ideally, and this is what we're really wanting to go for, and this is part of the reason why it's taken a while to get going, is because there's a lot of complexity into it. But we desire to have data both from self-assessing organizations. So being willing to report data that you have been managing or you have been undertaking within your own org. And then also from consultancies who see a number of different organizations. The ability to support both of those is really important to us. So overall, from a technology perspective, OWASP has an Azure cloud infrastructure. So the intention is to put a solution up in there and be able to, so we can be able to collect, analyze, store data contributed, limit the number of people that have access to the raw data. So for better or worse, people have a perception that if the numbers that they get within a SAMM assessment get leaked out, that in somehow it will lead to a breach of their company or shaming or something along those lines. And while the chances, I mean, there's a slim chance there, but compared to leaking data out of your JIRA from vulnerabilities, it's way too high level for anyone to be able to really craft any particular attack against your organization. However, it's still an interesting challenge to be able to take on. So one of the things that we've been looking at is different scenarios for the way people could contribute. We go from scenario one, where essentially the submitter is known and has agreed to be identified as a contributing party. So that's somebody that says, you know what, I'm all in on SAMM. I find it incredibly valuable, and I am completely fine with people knowing that we contribute to SAMM. It doesn't mean that you can look up Acme's profile and see, oh, you have a 1.26 in governance. You know, that's, I'm not doing business with you. It just means that, you know, you're identified as a contributed party, and it's not, you know, and it's not like the end of the world if people understand that you contribute. Again, it's not that we're disclosing individual scores completely tied to your company. The second scenario is submitters are known, but they don't want to be publicly identified. And so that takes a little bit of a different structuring in the data model under the covers, because we need a little bit more layers of abstraction between who the company is versus where their data is. So if for some instance somebody managed to be able to get some information out of the database, that it would be really difficult to trace it back to exactly which company it was. Then there's the third scenario that's even one step further, where the submitter is known, but they don't even want it recorded in the data set. So essentially there's a dummy organization in the data set, not even layers of abstraction, it just isn't there. However, by working with some of the SAMM team, we do know, like, there's a couple of individuals who know where the data came from and they know it's verifiable. The fourth scenario is completely anonymous. And there's pros and cons to completely anonymous. Some of the pros is we would actually get the data. The con is with it being completely anonymous, there's no way to verify it. So there's not, if you look at the threat model for junk data submissions, there's, so far we've been able to determine there's very little to gain by junking up the system. So at this point, I'm not initially worried that somebody would do so, but you know, it may be an important first step for somebody to be able to get approval from their legal department to submit completely anonymous data. There's other downsides to doing it that way that I'll talk about in a minute. But we wanted to make it an option, but also when we look at the analytics and the scoring and the comparative models, then we would want to give people the ability to say, I don't want any unverified data in the comparative set. Just so that you can say, hey, I want the higher quality data. I want the stuff that we know can be verified from organizations. So right now, there is a way you can send me some information, or send me like an output of the toolbox or something like that as for some of the seed data. So we're working through, we have a data model built. It supports both 1.5 and 2.0 at this point. And I've started going through, you know, working through the design of the baseline of application. So one of the things for today as well is I have a minimal number of slides on purpose. and this is a workshop. So I'm going to walk through some of the data elements and some of the base features that I have so far. But then honestly, I want your feedback. I want to know what features this system would need to be able to encourage you to be able to contribute. So some of the data elements we've looked at. So what we're trying to do is be able to set this up so that people can contribute data and we can have meaningful data that others can learn from without being able to directly identify an organization. So looking at trying to figure out some level of demographic information, and it may be, general geographic region, primary industry that the organization is in, and then ranges. So approximate number of developers, primary AppSec, secondary aspect or secondary AppSec is essentially like champions or security champions, security ninjas. Different organizations have different terms for them. And then primary SDL methodologies. So to know, because you'll see different patterns of what activities are done within the organizations based on SDL methodologies, what industry they're in, technologies they work with, stuff along those lines. So what we're trying to do is take a stab at figuring out what kind of metadata or what kind of demographic information about an organization would be useful. Because one of the main concerns or issues that people have had with the data set that BSIMM has is if you look at the distribution of the organizations that are in the BSIMM data set, it's usually very large organizations with much larger budgets. It's like the top, I don't know, top small percentage of organizations in terms of size and budget and such. So it makes it a lot more difficult for 50-person companies, 200-person companies, couple thousand-person companies to be able to find something to compare against. For their point in time, at their level of maturity, how are they doing? And so we're open to suggestions. If there's any other demographic information types that would make sense that we could use or that you would want to filter on, trying to find something that's a closer match to where your organization is without being too telling. Like, I don't really want latitude and longitude of headquarters because that's kind of a little too telling. So at this point, if you are in the scenario as a user consumer of SAMM, that you're looking at a single submission, you're willing to submit something one time for the good of all so that you can contribute to the data set, then the idea was you can either complete a questionnaire form on a site, you can upload a spreadsheet. We've also talked about actually giving the Excel toolbox the ability to submit scores to an API. You could get a results dashboard, edit if needed, that kind of thing. The thing is, though, if you want to do this, then you're in like the first three levels, first three scenarios where you're identifiable. Or actually, that's more of an issue here. If you want to do multiple submissions, meaning you would like to use Benchmark to manage your scores or manage your dashboard per se for SAMM, then you could create a profile, but at that point you can't be anonymous. Because if you are truly anonymous, there is no way for you to get back to your original data. There will be no identifier, no marker, no way to be able to tie it back to you. So, but if you wanted to do multiple submissions, then you'd have all of the abilities from the single submission, but you'd also be able to maintain or update the scoring. So as time goes on, as your initiatives go on, you would be able to predict. So, and we kind of do that in the toolbox right now, where you would be able to say, hey, at the end of the next phase, this is where we predict our scores would be. This would give you the ability to basically tag it and then say, all right, I've updated the answers to these particular questions and we're making this a milestone. And then you'd be able to see trending data across those milestones, like what's our velocity or how well are we doing in terms of improvements, and be able to give you those data visualizations to show you how well you're doing. But then ideally, right, if there's enough people in the system, then you could compare your velocity in a certain area against the average of others in similar demographics. And we have to be careful of those, because depending on your priorities, depending on your culture, stuff like that, that will have an impact on what your individual organization focuses on. So I do want to be careful, and this is an interesting problem to try and solve, is I don't want to create a setup where we end up into groupthink and everyone lemmings after everyone else just because all the averages say go this direction. It's supposed to be guidance and shows you what works and what may not. So, and I've talked about this a little bit as well. So going through like dashboards, comparative analysis, we'd separate the data from the organizations so that you could see, how well things were doing or not. I've had some thoughts in the realm of trying to support building communities where people would be able to put in essentially success stories. You could, or, hey, don't try to do this. Lessons learned from us in terms of things that were tried but didn't actually succeed. So ideally, I had this thought that it might make sense to be able to provide a platform for that, where people can say, hey, this is what worked for me. This is combinations that work for me. These are the types of integrations for things. But it does require commitment from certain user base in terms of being able to be willing to put the time and be willing to put the information out there. So from my perspective, like, I can try and envision this and dream it up, but I'd really love to hear from folks, what would you want to see? Like, would you envision possibly at your organization or at your consultancy, would you envision possibly using a tool online to be able to store and manage these numbers? Would you want to be able to integrate with it using APIs to be able to call and reference the models or be able to pull your data out? What kind of graphs or charts would you want? Stuff like that. So being a workshop, I'm all for trying to figure out what makes sense to you all. So please let me know what might make sense.
Hey, Brian, we did have a question come in that could stimulate some discussion, but
Okay.
also add to it, which is, how is assessment scope taken into consideration for benchmarking? For example, an organization of one sector may have assessed a single application or service, whereas the scope of another similar organization included all applications and services.
Okay. That's an excellent question, because SAMM is used multiple ways. And so let's see if I can go back to it. So that would be an interesting one to consider, adding the data elements. Let me make a note to think through on scope, because the interesting thing is when you look at SAMM, a lot of times governance and operations are usually more at the organizational level, and sometimes design, implementation, and verification are, and sometimes they're much more specific to a more narrow area. So I could see potentially looking at having data elements at a scope, being able to say, hey, this is a individual application versus this is a division or subset of an organization versus this is an entire organization. From y'all's perspective, would that make a difference? Would you want to know that the numbers came from one of those three scenarios?
Juan says yes. And Tony
I'm
says
guessing
yes.
Juan says yes because Juan asked.
And Tony as well. And I'd probably want it to be, I think it would be definitely an interesting data point to add to this part of the data elements.
Okay.
It's a little bit of the granularity of the assessment that that adds to the value of how to compare your assessment with other assessments.
Absolutely. So, I mean, what other thoughts do people have? Like, what questions have you been asked within your organizations as you use SAMM that you've wanted to be able to answer? Because, I mean, I want to aim for building something that people need and find useful and not end up spending 2 years building some behemoth worth of things that people use 5% of. So I want to make sure that we're tailoring it for something that's useful for SAMM to be able to build up the community. Because ideally, SAMM is basically outside of BSIM. SAMM is about it for trying to help you understand what you could do, how to structure the beautifully complex world of application security or secure development.
So Tony raised his hand, so I've enabled your audio, Tony, so you can definitely intervene.
Thanks, Devin. So overall, I think that you're like spot on in the majority of these areas, right? And I think that my like high level input is I think that getting this out there quicker rather than taking 2 years to perfectly engineer the solution is so much more valuable just because of what you just mentioned, right? Around that this data just really isn't available anywhere else. And I think it's incredibly invaluable. So overall, I think especially the data elements that you have up right now are really great. Two of the things I think that would be really useful as well would be, it's kind of like what I mentioned in my previous talk around self-assessment of how much risk tolerance do you have, right? And that's a loaded thing, and some people probably aren't very good at understanding their own risk tolerance, but like a simple, do you think your organization has a high risk tolerance, medium risk tolerance, or low risk tolerance? I think would also be a really good thing to drill down into. And then the other one being, and it's kind of touched by your primary industry, but I think that a question that we get asked a lot is organizations with similar regulatory compliance aspects, right? So, can I see data from other PCI, HIPAA, CCPA organizations? What are they doing, and how do I stack up against that?
Okay, so looking at possibly separate from industry, but looking at possibly identifying what compliance regulations you might be subject to.
Exactly. Right. So,
Okay.
And then there's so many different regulations that, you probably have to pick, the big three or so, but even like energy regulations, right? If you're, a DOE vendor or something like that, right? Like, there's, like I said, it kind of gets covered in primary industries, but, some of those regulatory bodies span a lot of different industries.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think we'd end up going well beyond 3 because being used on a global scale. But yeah, I mean, the preference is to not have fill in the blanks, but to provide like pick these.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I like that idea in terms of going, and so that people could see, given those kinds of restrictions or given those kinds of targets, what are people doing and where are they at in a similar situation under similar compliance?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Tony. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. And again, just kudos for all of this, because I think you're spot on here with everything, and I'm really excited to see this progress.
You and me both.
So Brian, we have a comment from Kimberly regarding scope and SAMM assessments, where they use SAMM assessments for each product team and then roll that data up for an overall score for AppSec. We present visualizations of data to executive team and board of directors. They really want to show those people how they're doing relative to other software developers of a similar size if possible. Second comment was, we're not sure that they would use the benchmark system to manage the roadmap, although they might share the data.
Okay. Thank you, Kimberly. So just on size, like that. I mean, I've left company size off, but I wasn't sure if people felt company size was an important demographic or not. I kind of left it off to try and help obscure who the company was.
An extra data element to consider might be language, since we're translating part of the model and including questions to other languages. It might make sense to at least capture the language of the data set, since some of the questions might be a little bit skewed differently in another language.
Gotcha. Okay, so language that the questionnaire was completed in, or primary language of the submission?
Yep.
Okay.
So just
and that would pretty much align with the languages that SAMM is translated to, right? Or do you want it more open than that?
No, it would probably link to the languages SAMM is translated to.
Okay.
So and to align on the question sets being used.
Okay.
I assume I assume that the version obviously will also be part of it.
Yeah, version is definitely part of it, or should be. Oh, it didn't make it to the element list, but yeah, version is definitely part of it.
Brian, one of the comments regarding number of developers and the concern around revealing the organization or company that might be identified with that information, maybe using terms like big, medium, or small to reduce that risk.
So basically large buckets.
Minimize the ability to be identified, yeah.
That's fine. That helps it be more accurate, less precise, and that's actually a good thing.
Another comment that's come in is what factors contributed to triggering the assessment? Was it because of regulation, because of certification, reaction to a breach, request from leadership?
Oh, that's interesting. So that would allow us to get basic numbers. That wouldn't be more of a comparative, but it would be able to tell us with it to a reasonable level why people are starting SAMM. Okay. Make a note for that.
Yeah, maybe general drivers as to why they've taken part or adopted it.
Gotcha. Is there any general concern about from people watching from contributing the data in terms of like different levels of granularity? Because ideally, I'd like to go down to the level of how the questions are answered. but we can also look at reporting at a more aggregate level, in terms of within a security practice area. Or the problem with going all the way up to the business function area is you lose a lot of detail and you lose a lot of understanding what contributed to that score. So I'm kind of curious, from the folks watching, the feelings on like sensitivity of your SAMM scores, in terms of whether or not you think you'd be allowed to contribute them.
Well, we have some comments that we would contribute. I think it harks back to the earlier conversation around saying that someone's baby is ugly. The fact that you may be sharing that with some folks, people are probably sensitive to that.
Well, I've in some of the SAM assessments I've done, I've had, even one more recently, I've had a company come back and they're like, we kind of looked at the toolbox and we're kind of worried because we're around 1, or a low 1, and we're kind of worried like we'll look badly. And honestly, in my experience, most organizations, the first time they run SAM, they're typically between like 0.8 and 1.2. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. That just means you have more room to grow. And so usually people don't go and start SAM, when their average is 2.8, 2.5 kind of thing. So. Mark, any chance you could elaborate on why you wouldn't be able to contribute? Is it legal concerns?
Mark, I've unmuted you. Oh yeah, maybe you don't have audio available. So if you can share that through audio, if not through the chat.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
So I work for Fortune 50, and we're very protective of anything about ourselves, right? We just don't share. When you're large, everybody wants to sue you for anything perceived or real.
Understood.
Or not, right? So, or imaginary, I meant to say. So yeah, I know I wouldn't even ask this question because I already know the answer is that, I've worked with legal, but it's a different mindset when you're huge and everybody is always out to get you because, well, they are.
I totally understand. I was at Microsoft's TWC when the top 10 call came out for 2017, and I almost got them to let me contribute the data they had in-house, and then somebody in legal was like, nope, it only takes one person to write one blog post about all of these vulnerabilities that Microsoft had found internally, separate from the fact that they found them and fixed them before they were sent to production. But yeah, I totally understand.
It's not a reality issue, because, how to put it nicely, people, like other things sometimes we deal with today, the facts don't seem to matter a lot of times.
Yeah, agreed. It's just
and it's hard, right? Perception is everything, and when you're constantly on the defensive, you get really,
Totally understand. Is there any, could you do something like scenario 3 where there's like a couple of people managing SAM would know that y'all submitted, but it's not in the data set anywhere?
I won't even tell you how many people we have in app security role, which you can read between the lines. Okay. So yeah, no sharing. So like I can give you a totally different scenario, which will help you understand. When you see companies that advertise who uses their products and they put the emblems up of those companies, right? Their moniker, you know, the McDonald's symbol because McDonald's uses XYZ software company or product. How many companies have you ever seen put up Ford? Ever? Any?
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
Yeah, you really haven't seen many,
I got
right? We take it really serious. Matter of fact, I had somebody leave the company and they started up a company, they started up their own consulting company with a cloud service, and they put the Ford logo out there, and I immediately reported them to legal, even though the other guy's a friend, and said, you need to send a cease and desist letter. I mean, we take it really seriously.
Okay. Well, if your culture ever shifts one day.
Well, we've been around 100 plus years, so I'm not counting on that kind of shift anytime soon.
Totally understand.
Just trying to give you a dose of reality, right? Because the very agile small startups and even big ones that are small and young have a whole different world to deal with.
Yeah. No, and that's been one of the fascinating things about working with SAMM is the difference between the sizes of the organizations, the cultures. It's been just absolutely fascinating how full spectrum it is.
Just to give you a little bit of an extra data point, as part of the registration for the user day, I, between brackets, sneakily added the question, would you be interested to participate in our OWASP benchmark initiative? So can we contact you? And about 50% of the 350 plus respondents said yes. So at least there's some, I would say, there's definitely an interest by a majority of the people that registered for the user day. Now, how much that would result in effectively donating data is something else, obviously, but it is higher than I expected.
That's promising. We'll see how many can get through their legal departments.
Yes.
Brian, Seva, and Mark. Hi, this is Juan.
Hi, Juan.
Summarization of information or gathering of information is a way to anonymize the information. So maybe you can think on a mechanism like, say, so I will donate the information, but you cannot put this information in the benchmark unless it's blended over with at least 2 or 3 companies of the same certain characteristics, so to speak. So even though the information is there, it's not going to be able to be individualized because the information cannot be used unless is blended with another 2 or 3 different companies the same size, and you will be anonymizing the other 2 or 3 companies at the same time as well. Mm-hmm. But it will be valuable information, and it will be a way to ensure, well, I mean, there should be some technical details on how to actually figure out the information can be provided in a way that it cannot be disclosed until the criteria is met. But I guess that would be a good way to maybe facilitate getting that information from these companies that are highly adverse to sharing any type of information, especially in vulnerabilities or their maturity levels.
Yeah, I could see that possible in some scenarios. It's similar to the third scenario we talked about in terms of you contribute, but there's no record in the system of who you are. But somebody knows, like, because they helped manage it for you. And that's the thing, right? So the reason why pure anonymous is considered unverified is because it would be everything we could to make sure it was legitimately anonymous. Like there was no way to trace back, oh, you didn't talk to us, but you used the company email. Or we figured out that the Gmail you used was attached to your LinkedIn that tells us what company you work for, kind of thing. So there's ways to do that, but that data would have to be considered unverified because there's no way to find out whether or not, there's nobody to talk to and no way to validate whether or not that data is like legitimate from a SAMM assessment. So, but I do like the idea of doing some level of aggregation. And that's the plan once we get overall, but I hadn't thought about essentially staging it until a certain critical mass was reached to then publish. So.
Yeah, that would have been one of my questions. What do you think we should be, or would we have as, I would say, a minimal critical baseline number of data sets to be able to, in a meaningful way, compare an assessment with the benchmark?
I would say it depends how granular you want to get in terms of the demographics. I'd say I would like as a minimum to probably have at least 5 data sets for a given set of criteria. So like for a geographic region and industry and stuff like that. So it may be that given, if you try and do a search, like you've contributed data, so you're trying to do a search for comparison, given the criteria that you submit that you'd like the data to be filtered by to do the aggregation, you would only get options that would have 5 or 8 or 10 or as a minimum number that would fit the criteria that you specified. So I don't have an exact number yet. I'm trying to work through scenarios essentially to try and determine what gives you enough fidelity to be able to tell to tell meaningful data in terms of comparison.
Mm-hmm. There was a remark or a question from Bruce in the chat as well. There was so we started, or we tried this a couple of years ago. So there was this I would say several years old data set from measures against SAMM version 1.0. Are those still useful, or would they be problematic to use as I would say, to compare?
It's a good question, Bruce. So it's an interesting thing. So when we originally started the idea for benchmark and we started the data model, it was at 1.2. We're going to 1.2. And then it was also 1.5. But we built the model in a way that could support multiple versions. So with some minor tweaking, the model also supports 2.0. So the idea was, or my goal is to be able to support both 1.x and 2.0 data in there. Now, for comparison's sake, you can't really get 100% comparison because some of the changes in 2.0, I mean, we've added an entire new business function and we've moved some of the other things around. However, a large part of the model still maps at a higher level. So the goal was to work through and map what we could comparatively between the different versions, between a 1.x model and a 2.x model.
So given enough mapping, even with, for instance, like BSIM of a couple of the, I would say, activities, it would be comparable.
If we stick to a higher level, yes. So BSIM having similar origins to SAMM, that at a higher level, at a security practice level, there are similarities in some of the areas that we could use for high level comparisons. And that would be, I think that would be something that would definitely be useful. It would something we would need to maintain, but it would definitely be something useful within the system.
Hey, Brian, Bart here. I was wondering, at some point in time, we also discussed kind of the quid pro quo type of donations, in a sense that you would, if you would not contribute data sets, you would get access to some data, but only in a very aggregated form, without any, any possibility to query in more details. When you would be submitting data as an organization, you wouldn't be allowed to get more access or more query power or whatsoever on things, as a way to incentivize organizations to donate data sets. Is that something that you're still considering? Because I think the whole point, of course, is of having organizations contributing data sets, and it might help organizations, consider donating because they get extra features out of it, while we still want to keep anonymity. That's I think the baseline. We don't want to give that up. But it might be an incentive for organizations to contribute. And in the end, that's what we need, as much as possible data sets, as many as possible.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that, Bart. It's working through the details of how that would look. So initially, I think I'm looking at having essentially high-level metrics in terms of like gross overall aggregation of the data that you could view from an anonymous perspective, where you don't have an account, you haven't contributed data, but in general, we can give you some high-level metrics on where the data stands within the contributed data sets so far. But like you said, if you're willing to contribute, that would give you the ability to you would have an account and you would be able to run more detailed queries. You could get more specificity in terms of finding out, like within a certain set of demographic criteria, are people really doing this particular type of activity? Like how many people in that range are actually doing it? You know, what are their maturity scores in general? Average, high, low kind of thing. So I'm definitely, at this point, I'm still going down that road of there is a much higher level, just general information, anonymous view. And then there is a, hey, we maintain an account, we've contributed data, you can get more accurate demographic information related to closer to your organization.
There's also a related question forwarding from the YouTube chat, since this is also live streamed on YouTube, and there's a Q&A on there as well, or at least a chat functionality. This is from Scott Gute. He's asking if there would be a certification process for assessors.
That's a great question, Scott. We've talked about this for a number of years now, whether or not we needed a certification process for SAMM. The interesting challenge is if you talk to 6 different SAMM assessors, it's highly likely you'll have at least 5 different collection models, or like how they go through and ask the questions, score things, what scopes they look at, stuff like that. So it's something that I'd love to have conceptually, because in theory, having a certification model for a SAMM assessor should result in more consistent data in terms of SAMM scoring and being able to compare, be able to say, you know, a particular answer to a question at one organization is directly comparable to the same question to another, because we know that, you know, there's at least some baseline that people are applying. That said, it's also a pretty sizable undertaking to actually build a certification process. And while we've talked about it, it hasn't been something to date so far. And Seba can correct me, or Bart can correct me if I'm wrong at this point, but it's not something we've had the time or made the decision to invest the time into actually building, but we have talked about having it.
Yeah. Well, I can only testify that personally, I've received quite a couple of questions on certification or list of assessors. Bart, you wanted to say something?
Yes, indeed. And to add to that, I think one of the ideas that was there is maybe consider kind of a reputation system as an alternative to a certification scheme. But indeed, it's an interesting question and even more difficult one to answer. At this moment, I don't think the idea is to go towards a certification scheme. But getting a view on how accurate a data point is somehow would be interesting. And whether that's through a certification scheme or a reputation system or some other way, that would be interesting to have or to know. So if there's any good ideas on how to increase that assurance in a data point, that would be interesting to have somehow.
Definitely.
All right. I would say in the interest of time, I think we can probably wrap up the workshop now.
Kimberly had one last question.
Yep.
She asked, have you thought about a baseline of answers or artifacts that validate accuracy of answers for a subset of key questions? Trying to think. So depending on how you do a SAMM assessment, some people may ask for that. A lot of the organizations I've done SAMM assessments with, they probably don't have the ability to provide. It gets a little more audit-like that way. And I personally, and again, this goes to the very nature of the way people do SAMM assessments, is I have not treated them like audits. So I don't typically go through and say, you say you're doing security testing in your build pipeline, show me documentation evidence that it's actually happening. That is an interesting question. I've been doing some work with CIS and non-voting technologies, getting SAMM integrated as a process assessment there. And we're looking at trying to figure out what groupings or baseline ranges of SAMM scores would denote like what other activities might need to be done. Depending on how mature your process is there other activities that would need to be done in terms of trying to assess a product or assess something else about your organization? So it's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I have an answer for it yet. We've thought about it. But I think it's in the similar bucket where we've thought about weighting things and we've thought about having an asymmetrical model. There are things that we've thought about, but we haven't reached a point of deciding that it's something that we would make a change for. If that makes sense.
Can I maybe just add to that? Yeah, and I'm having some echo, sorry for that. That in a sense, the quality criteria in the assessment model are actually also a way of verifying the answers. So the idea in SAMM 2.0 was to not only measure coverage, but also measure quality of an activity. And so the quality criteria, if you look at the assessment sheet, you will see that for some of these questions, you will find quality criteria that match, like, okay, do you have like a, I don't know, a coding guideline available, or do you have something to prove, basically? Now, so that's the assessment part. Whether you then want to prove that towards the benchmarking project, that's another question. So I think the question can have two different parts as an answer. First of all, assessment, but I think that's covered in the SAMM 2.0 model to some extent, at least. That's what we try to do. And then the question is whether you want to translate that further towards the benchmarking project.
Yep, that's definitely been an interesting challenge for us, for not just breadth of coverage, but depth of quality.
Just a time check. We have about 5 minutes remaining.
So that leaves us with only one question, Brian. When is it going to be up and running?
I was waiting for someone to ask that. I don't know. I'd love to give you an answer. I'd love to have something running before the end of the year. Right now, I'm planning to do a lot of the development in .NET. If anybody has cycles and wants to help contribute and such, by all means, let me know. Right now, I'm working on essentially design mockups, so screen mockups, so I have a target. The goal is, and part of the reason why I wanted to do this today is I want to have an idea of the end goal, not necessarily going to be 100% complete before first release, but when designing a system, knowing your ultimate goal can make you may make different design decisions than only making very short-term decisions. So the goal was to try and figure out what we're aiming for. And then it will be to figure out what's a minimum viable product that's usable that we can build on and start adding features to and such. So.
No, great. And so I would say if you'd have any user stories or aspects that you'd say, okay, we can include others, or we can have other volunteers within our community or the broader OWASP community, or even paid for development capabilities activate for that we can help accelerate this, feel free to reach out. Huh?
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, I plan to basically run it as a project in GitHub. So it would be easy to access the different issues and stuff within there to be able to contribute or comment and such. So that's the goal. But I think it's long overdue. It's been something, but I think we've also kind of been waiting for the right time where we have enough momentum for it.
Just make sure you're not sucked into an OWASP top 10 benchmark this year.
No, the top 10 got pushed out a little bit. But the reason why, part of the reason I work on both is there's very similar data collection and analysis requirements. So it's kind of interesting. I can actually benefit both projects by actually bridging them. So, but thank you everybody for your feedback and your questions and everything. That absolutely helps today. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.